Hey guys, this is Keri at McKinney Knittery. I want to talk to you about gauge swatches today. If you are a new knitter and you've never knit a gauge swatch before, basically what you're doing is you are knitting a sample piece of fabric so you can get an idea of your knitting tension or the size of your stitches with the yarn and needles that you're planning on using for your pattern. Knitwear designers, when they write their pattern, they have a specific tension that they use, and that's what determines the measurements of your garment, specifically your sweater. So if your stitches are tighter, your sweater is going to end up too small. And if your stitches are looser than the gauge, your sweater is going to be too big. So we want to get our best estimate of what your fabric is actually going to be when you start knitting your sweater so that you can make the right size. Typically, knitters will knit a swatch flat. It usually looks something like this. We have a garter border around so it doesn't roll up. And when you do that, you're knitting on one side and you're purling on the back. For some knitters, myself included, my purl stitches are much looser than my knit stitches. And so I was taking the time to knit a gauge swatch, and then I would knit my sweater, and I would find that the gauge on my sweater was totally different than the gauge on my swatch. So I discovered that you can knit a gauge swatch in the round so that you have a better idea of what your tension is going to be when you're actually knitting your sweater in the round. So I'm going to show you how to do that today. So we're going to move the camera and I will kind of zoom in and show you what I'm doing. Okay, so now I'm going to show you kind of close up how to knit your swatch in the round without knitting a full circle. What I do when I cast on, when I knit in the round, or when I swatch in the round, is you want to add some extra stitches on each end because these edges are going to come out really loose. I know that on the pattern that I'm working on right now, I need a gauge of 20 stitches over 4 inches. So I cast on about 5 on each side. So instead of just the 20, I actually cast on 30 stitches. That's going to give me plenty of room on the edges to not have to measure here because clearly that's not an accurate stitch right there. So I cast on 30. I am going to knit a couple of rows in garter down here. Stockinette tends to roll, and so this kind of just helps my gauge swatch lay flat. So I knit 30, I turn it over, I knit another row of 30, I turn it over, and I knit one more row of 30 just to get my little garter edge there. So what I do when I'm knitting in stockinette is we're going to just start knitting across, which is, I'm kind of in the middle right now. I'm going to finish up this row and show you what happens at the end because that's kind of the tricky part. So we're going to knit all the way to the edge, and when we get over there, just because of the nature of what we're doing, those edge stitches are very, very loose, and that's okay. So don't worry about that. That's why we cast on extra. So I'm coming up here to the end. You're going to notice these start to get really loose and floppy, like this guy's kind of crazy. That's okay. I kind of give him a little, just kind of pull on these guys to kind of get them out of the way. Now here's the cool part. Instead of turning and purling across, I'm actually just going to slide my swatch back to the other end of my needle. So I'm just ready to start knitting again. So I pull my needle over, I'm ready to start knitting. And what I do with my working yarn, it's still over here on the wrong side. So I just kind of drape it across. You don't want to pull it super tight. When you pull it tight, it's going to make those edges turn in. It's actually better for it to be a little bit loose. So I just kind of drape this yarn behind me. I pull my needle around and I'm going to start knitting again. This first little bit is a little bit fiddly because there's no tension there. That's okay. Again, that's why we cast on those extra stitches. Usually about 3 or 4 in. There we go. My tension's starting to tighten up. The yarn's got something to hold on to. And now my tension is kind of back to normal. So I'm going to knit all the way across my 30 stitches. Try to do that kind of quickly for you guys, and then I'll show you how to slide it over one more time. Basically, you're just going to do this at least for 4 inches. Some people even say to knit a gauge swatch of 6 inches. As you become more experienced, you're going to kind of get an idea. Once I hit a point where my tension, I know that I'm knitting at my normal tension. I know that's a good place for me to measure. But as you're starting, I think 4 to 6 inches is a great length to knit. because that gives you time to get in the groove, knit as you would normally knit, and measure that tension. Okay, so I'm here to the end again. I'm at that really loose crazy stitch. I'm gonna knit that guy. Okay, now instead of turning, I'm just sliding my yarn to the other end of my needle. I'm gonna pull this needle around, I'm gonna drape this piece behind, and I'm gonna keep going. Okay, now here's a sample of one I've done in the past. This guy's really big. I had some other things going on here, but this is what the back looks like. So you're gonna have all these loose pieces. You can see where it kind of curls in over here and these edges are really loose. So when it's time for you to measure your swatch, you're gonna want to really kind of get in the middle where your tension looks nice and even, and this is the place that you're gonna measure. Okay, so I want to show you how to measure your gauge swatch. You're going to do this twice. You want to measure your swatch before you block it. You're going to measure your gauge. You are going to measure the width of your swatch as well as the length of your swatch. Make a little note of that. And then you're going to block your swatch, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then after your swatch dries, you're going to want to measure it again. Different yarns behave differently after they've been blocked. Some yarns will grow, some yarns will tighten up. And so you want to know what's going to happen when you block your sweater. You don't want any surprises. So the way that we measure our gauge is we're going to come into this middle section of our swatch. There are all kinds of tools that you can use to measure your swatch, but all I use is a ruler, and then I just have something pokey so that I don't get lost in what I'm doing. So I'm gonna take my little 0 and I'm gonna line it up at the very edge of the stitch. Now remember, a knit stitch looks like a V, and so we're gonna go to the outside of that little V, and I'm just gonna count my stitches all the way across until I reach that 4 inches. Okay, so I've got, and I use my pokey thing. This is just kind of my weird thing. I just kind of poke the middle of my stitch, and that's how I make sure I'm not losing count. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Now the end of this V ends up right here on that 4 inches, so I can tell that I have 20 stitches over 4 inches. Sometimes you might, like if it ended right here, sometimes you've got a half, and that's okay. Just make note of that, and then in class, we'll talk about what to do with that. Okay, I want to talk to you about blocking your swatch. Like I said earlier, before you block it, you want to measure it. You want to take note of what your gauge is. You want to measure the length and the width of it, and just take note, jot it down, save it. I usually put it on a Post-it note. And then you're going to block it. So the way you block a swatch is the same way you would block your garment. You're going to soak it in water, like lukewarm water. I usually put it in a little bowl, and let it soak for 30 minutes. If you've got some wool wash, you can add a drop or 2 of that. I don't always use wool wash for my swatch, but you can. So you're going to let it soak for 30 minutes. That just lets all the fiber get fully saturated, and then you're going to take it out. I roll mine up in a towel and try to press a lot of that water out, and then I just lay it flat. Some people like to pin their swatches down to keep them nice and square. You can. I usually don't, because I want to see what the fiber is going to naturally do without me stretching and manipulating it. It is okay if you want to just pin the corners to keep it flat, but oftentimes I just kind of lay mine out. I smooth out the edges, and then you just let it dry completely. When it's totally dry, then you get to measure it again. Like I showed you, you're going to measure your gauge swatch, take note of the length and width. You want to know if your yarn grew, so that you might want to knit your sweater a little bit shorter than you think it needs to be, because it's going to grow after you block it. You don't want it to turn into a dress unexpectedly. So those are just good things to know, so you know what your yarn's going to do. One last thing. There are a million reasons why people don't want to swatch. Some of them being they don't want to waste their time and they don't want to waste their yarn. I will tell you from experience that I would rather spend the hour ahead of time with my gauge swatches to make sure it's correct than spend the 60 hours to knit my sweater and then it not fit at the end. The other thing, if you're worried about running out of yarn, You can always undo this and add it to your project. It can kind of be like your backup yarn. I will say that if you're gonna swatch in the round, some people like to cut this piece right here and lay it nice and flat, and it gives us these cute little fringy edges, and it is really cute. But I don't cut mine because if I am just a little bit short, I can now undo this and I can actually use this yarn in an emergency if I need it. So I think the time and the yarn are well worth it to make sure your sweater fits in the end. Okay, one more thing. What happens if you measure your gauge swatch and it does not match what your pattern is asking for? You will need to make another swatch and adjust your needle size. So if you have too many stitches, let's say your gauge calls for 20 and you are like, oh no, I have 22, I've got too many stitches. That means your stitches are too small and you want to go up a needle size and try again. If you don't have enough stitches, maybe you only got 18 when you needed 20, that means your stitches are too big and you need to go down a needle size. I have found roughly that anytime I go up a needle size, like one size, will typically give me an extra stitch over that 4 inches, or take away a stitch if I'm going up or down. That's not always the case, but if you're trying to think, okay, I was like 4 stitches off, you might want to go up or down more than 1 needle size if you're that far off. If you're really close, like maybe you've tried a couple of swatches and you're kind of in between sizes, or you're just 1 stitch off. There are some things we can do to adjust the size that you knit. If you are taking my sweater class, that's one of the things we're going to talk about in the first lesson. If our gauge is not exactly right, sometimes that's okay. Sometimes that's even a good thing if you're between sizes. And I will show you kind of some knitter's math to adjust your size dependent upon your swatch. Nails? Okay. I got my nails done because I tried to paint them myself and they looked crazy. So this should look a little more professional.
They look great.